Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert webinar here at Eurofound. Today's webinar is dedicated to understanding trust in public institutions. I'm Tadas Leončikas, Research Manager here at Eurofound, and I'm delighted to have Shana Cohen, Director of TASC, Irish think tank here in Dublin. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. We've done research ourselves at TASC, which is an independent think tank here in Dublin, not at an EU level, but at a country level on public services and trust. So I'm very happy to be here.
Over the next 45 minutes, we will look through findings and results from recent Eurofound reports on the subject of trust in institutions. We will try to look into patterns and trends over time. We will also try to go beyond speaking high-low trust levels and understand reasons and factors shaping trust. And we will also look into the role of civic engagement and the way society can get involved and shape trust and nurture it. So for the beginning, let's take a look at the first graph, Eurobarometer data that depict trust levels over time in the EU and in national political institutions, parliaments and governments. The top blue line shows the trust in the EU. A few observations about developments over time. First of all, during the Great Recession, we saw a dip, plummeting trust, and that gave rise to big concerns about crisis of trust. There had been talk about deficit of trust. A number of reports appeared on the subject of trust, including ours, Eurofound's. But now looking back from 2019, what we see is that levels of trust have been recovered. On the one hand, it may show certain inertia and stability, more of it than was expected. On the other hand, we only looked at the levels of those who trust, and proportion of people who do not trust either EU or national institutions is also high and remains high. Shana, did you come across these trends and data in your work?
Just to look at your data first, what I struck me with it is first that pre-crisis there was a spike in trust in both national and EU institutions. But the second thing that I think is very important to look at is the fact that EU institutions have consistently remained higher in terms of trust than national institutions. And we have to think about why that is, regardless of the recession. So it can't just be economic factors that are driving the difference in trust between the institutions.
That brings us to an interesting question of where the locus of trust is. And that's why it is interesting to look at more institutions than just political ones that are typically covered in the media. So let's look at the next graph, which shows certain hierarchy of institutions in terms of level of trust they get from the citizens. So one particular pattern in the EU countries is that, for example, local authorities always have higher level of trust, and we'll come back to that. Another perspective is to assess how countries differ in terms of the level of trust, and this is a particular strand of research, mostly about convergence here at Eurofound, which tries to assess whether countries become more similar or more diverse over time. You can find more of that in our reports. In this snapshot, that shows data from the latest EQLS Quality of Life Survey 2016, we see a set of different institutions. That includes banks, humanitarian organizations, legal system, and we could stop on the legal system thereabout in the middle. This one is interesting in the perspective of high difference between the least trusting country and most trusting country. So the dispersion or variation is very high. And even if we tend to focus on political institutions in debates often, rule of law apparently is also a challenge if we take a broad EU perspective in terms of how diverse that is, how uneven that is across countries.
I would just interject there, because I think what's interesting about this is that you trust in the police and trust in charitable organizations. Those are very tangible for people. Like a police officer is somebody you would see in your neighborhood or somebody on the street or a police car. in a charitable organization, you might see what their services they're offering at a local resident, so it's immediate. Versus trust in banks, you go into a bank, but you know the banks are responsible for the financial crisis, at least in part. The media and the government and the parliament, again, you're getting more and more distant from your everyday life. So I found that very interesting. I also found it interesting that the governments that invest in public services generate more trust. And that corresponds with trust in the police and charitable organizations versus those who invest less. There's greater distrust.
So you are bringing very important points here that speak about reasons behind high or low trust. I saw a question came in from the audience which asks about whether trends in trust are comparable across all EU countries, or are there some outliers? That gives us an opportunity to go back and reinforce your point. In social and political science research, there have been explorations and findings that suggested that those countries where governance quality is generally high, those manage to have the national institution trust about at similar level or higher than trust in the EU. However, there are not that many countries in the EU that have this pattern. It also suggests that for other countries where there isn't enough trust or citizens do not find their national institutions being trustworthy, there might be a mechanism of compensation. They look for transnational institutions to provide or compensate for the shortcomings. Another difference that is striking is in the regional perspective, and I'm moving to the next graph that we have from the forthcoming policy brief on quality of life in capital cities. That compares different urbanization categories in terms of how they trust national institutions or local authorities. So you recognize here, by comparing the left and right sides of the graphs, the pattern we mentioned before. The trust in local authorities in the EU is considerably higher than in the national institutions. And on the right side, we don't see much difference between major cities, towns, or rural areas in their relationship to local authorities. But if we look back at national institutions, we see by how much the capital cities, the major cities, largest cities in Europe, have more trust in national institutions. And that is very similar if we looked at, for example, satisfaction with democracy. So regional divide sticks out and becomes very important these days. And we know in a number of countries that it had certain or influenced certain political developments.
If you look just here in Ireland, we have a project in rural Ireland, and I was really struck by the trust in rural areas for local authorities and the distrust. Looking at this data, you would assume it in national institutions, and that would indicate, and you can see that in the Irish case, a distrust in policy, that national policymakers are not on the side of rural areas. And that's in part, you can see that in decline, that for instance, in Ireland, policy-wise, you would see the lack of investment in broadband, the lack of investment in infrastructure, punitive measures like carbon tax. There's not enough constructive policy engagement with rural areas. But on the other hand, they trust their local officials. Again, I would go back to the fact that they can have a conversation with them, that there's a relationship, versus the capital, where you probably have the concentration of economic wealth.
Thanks for that. So you are depicting a few factors: encounter, engagement with public service provision, and as well direct contact with authorities or representatives, which is higher in case of local authorities. Another question came in asking about trust in South Europe and candidate countries. We have produced at Eurofound a report dedicated to quality of life and touching about trust questions in candidate countries. So you would be very welcome to find that. As I mentioned, the compensatory mechanism is well seen in case of the candidate countries where local authorities are trusted less than the national ones. So it brings us back to the question of where the locus of trust is and how people experience national institutions or public institutions more generally. And Shana, as you suggested, probably public services play a role here. One of the crucial findings of Eurofound's research, I'm moving to the next graph, were about the role public services play in shaping trust. There is a very high correlation. And our audience, especially students and researchers, will know that in a lot of social and political science research, survey data on trust in institutions are there for a long time, for decades, and they have been analyzed and overanalyzed many times. However, in most of that research, data sources would provide information about socioeconomic background of the respondents, possibly about certain attitudes, but rarely in those surveys there would be information about how people perceive quality of public services. So we had this advantage in the quality of life survey that we collected information on how people see quality of services, and we had a quite big range of different public services. And it was continuously after previous rounds of the EQLS that we had this finding. Trust in institutions on average would be highly correlated in how people see the quality of public services. At the bottom of the graph, you see how negative impact perception of social tensions make. However, the size of that effect is just about a half of the positive effect that good public services can make. So that had been a very important finding, and it also sheds some light on why there are outliers, why trust has not recovered or has dropped so much in countries that underwent austerity, that suffered cuts to public services, or lost trust in institutions also for other reasons.
I can tell you from our own research at TASC, we have a project on the top 10% in 4 European countries. And in Spain, access to health services has been a big issue. And so, for instance, under austerity, they limited access for migrants and became highly politicized. We found the opposite in Sweden, where public services are a given and people expect them, regardless of their income bracket. So the less politicized, the sort of more neutral, the question of high quality, accessible public services is, the more trust we found actually in our own research. Again, going back to Ireland, there's a 2-tier system, and its cause generates distrust because there's limited access to free, high quality services. You have long waiting lists. And the more sort of politicized and the more, to be honest, corrupt public institutions are seen, the less, obviously, the less trust you have. Like, for instance, in Spain, you have very low trust in national institutions, and that's associated with distrust and transparency and accountability.
So what is interesting in what you said from this recent research that TASC carried out, that 10% of richest citizens also do not feel that they don't need public services. They do look for quality services. Is that
yes,
what you were
absolutely.
saying?
So
yeah.
For people who are relying upon income, who don't have a big house or several houses, or they haven't inherited a lot of money, they're relying upon their income to be in the top 10%. And we found across the board in the 4 countries that we studied, Ireland, the UK, Sweden, and Spain, that people don't mind paying taxes. They don't mind a progressive tax system. What they do mind is a lack of access to public services, because those services are their safety net. Maybe they don't want to pay for, or they'll pay for private school, or they'll pay for private health insurance, but they want to know that they have access to quality services. You may not shed a tear for them if they're in that situation, but if you're talking specifically about trust, the fact that they want access to those services and those services make them trust public institutions more, then that's a factor.
So that is a very interesting observation, empirical finding from your research, but also food for thought, material for reflection, for broadening the horizon in understanding what trust levels mean and what public services mean in European context. There's a good case that could be made for seeing public services as something particular to European social model, because, as you said, it is across the whole spectrum of society that people value the services. And there is an argument in the context of economic analysis that suggests that well-being of people can only be increased so much by income once they reach certain level of affluence. And further improvements depend, further quality of life depends on basically public services, on engagement with services, with other citizens, with organizations that shape overall social climate. But for the moment, could we take a look at those who are in disadvantageous positions? And another piece of analysis that rarely comes up in trust debate that we did, I invite you to take a look at the next graph, was in relation to social insecurities. Another large theme, a large concern that emerged over the recession years. And another area of research that Eurofound looked into. So here we see three graphs that depict relationship between insecurity felt with regard to employment, insecurity with regard to risk of losing one's accommodation, and uncertainty about having adequate income in old age. Well, what is interesting is that all these correlate. We see a two-dimensional display of these phenomena here, but more rigorous analysis confirms the correlation, direct correlation between insecurity and low trust is there. It was interesting also to see and compare these different types of insecurity and find that it was in particular old age income insecurity or uncertainty about having adequate income in old age that was associated with low trust mostly. Well, again, it invites for reflection of what that means. An interpretation I could suggest would be that with regard to accommodation, where the link is weaker, people probably take a degree of responsibility for their situation themselves. Similar, employment insecurity. However, securing adequate income in old age, years from where you are now or closer or further, is difficult to ensure at individual level, difficult to do just by yourself. And here, there are possibly legitimate expectations towards the system of social protection and state more generally.
I would say that if you look at a couple of examples, healthcare, access to healthcare, but increasingly also access to social care for older people, they attribute that to the state. So it's not in the EU, but if you look at the United States, Medicare is a highly valued national program because it's health coverage for over 65. If you look at the NHS in the UK, you can correlate in some ways the challenges the NHS is facing under austerity with declining trust in national institutions because the NHS is such a prized possession, but it offers free health care for older people. The fact that it's so difficult to get social care as well undermines trust. And so I can see that because they expect the state to cover that, especially after a lifetime of working and paying taxes. That's the one thing that people expect back from the state is to be taken care of in terms of their health. And it's not here in your data, but if you also look at the underlying issue of loneliness, isolation, going back to kind of other data that you've shown me about social engagement, it's kind of providing that sense of community. If the state is supporting those kinds of activities to make sure that older people, one, have medical care, and two, are not isolated, which fits in with their health, then that would generate trust in the state because you feel like you're being looked after at the end of your life.
Yeah. The role of losing trust or the consequences of losing trust in state provision in a system of social protection, be it state or otherwise funded, may have serious consequences. Economists speak about a risk of vicious circle in case trust gets lost in the system and people withdraw and try to find partial or individual solutions for their problems, the system gets further weakened and then has more difficulties to recover and function well. That's one aspect. Another interesting aspect, if we go just back for a moment to the graph on insecurities, is that levels of trust start falling not at any, not gradually, but at some particular threshold of insecurity felt. So the fact that insecurity feeds low trust does not necessarily mean that you have to suggest policies that provide total security, which is not necessarily feasible. It doesn't mean that there should be an expectation that state will resolve all challenges of individual life. Not at all. But there is a particular level of insecurity where the trust starts falling much. And it is important to understand this if we think about policy design for a few reasons. From the research perspective, I think this is sometimes getting missed in the debate on trust and factors of trust. We've seen, even in research literature, a suggestion that trust depends on attitude, on civic attitude, on view. And I wanted to quote one particular excerpt from a recent report of Dustman and colleagues from 2017 on Europe's trust deficit. They came to a suggestion that in EU member states, there is a divide between those who are optimistic about the future versus those who are pessimistic, between those who embrace change and globalization versus those who fear them, and between those who live in large metropolitan areas and adopt what might be referred to as cosmopolitan attitudes versus those who live in small towns or on the countryside. Well, so this suggests that there is a divide between those who embrace change and those who don't. And what we try to suggest with our data, that it is not at every level or not in every life situation that people are in position to embrace that change. Do you find something like that from your studies?
We found in a couple of projects, it's not that people, what we found is it's not that people don't want to embrace change. It's again that there's not enough government-led support for adaptation. There's sort of an expectation that this is the situation, you need to adapt, versus having in place the infrastructure or the interventions necessary to help people adapt. You particularly find that, or we've particularly found that in rural areas where there have been instructions. In fact, just from an interview, there was a man who used to be the chairman of a dairy company here in Ireland, and he said farmers always do what they're told. The state comes in, they tell them, cut down the hedgerows. That'll be good for, that's what we need for rural areas. They cut down the hedgerows, and then 10 years they come back and said, that's bad for climate change. Let the hedgerows grow again. And it's like, okay, we've done what we're told. And you've come here, and the farmer was saying, you've come here, you're imposing a carbon tax. You tell us we can't drive at night home from the pub. And you tell us that we shouldn't have cut down the hedgerows, and you told us to cut down 10 years ago. So there's not the kind of, we're here for you, we're going to help you through this transition. I don't think it's a question of not wanting to adapt or not wanting to change. It's not having the kind of individualistic focus that here's a situation, get with the picture.
Right. The hypothesis we try to suggest that regardless of how the government plays its role, it comes down to resources people have. Resources they accumulate, have or have access to, may be acquired in different ways. And here's the beauty of diversity of different social models and arrangements. But certain level of resources has to be there for people to have basic level of security so that they could embrace change. It's not about an attitude alone. It's about certain level of resources to have. And this is important to think when we think about social protection system, governments, but also society as a whole. and how it manages the resources that it gains from economic growth, the resources that it has and distributes or doesn't distribute or distributes in different ways. So that's food for thought from analysis that we began on trust levels, and then found its relation to public services, and then found the relation to social insecurities. By the way, in the citation I gave, they also point out to this divide between metropolitan areas and the rest, and suggest again that this is about cosmopolitan attitudes. In a more rigorous research we did, comparing the levels of trust between cities, towns, and rural areas, we found that by and large it comes down to economic security, ability to make ends meet, income people have, education they have. So all the higher levels of trust in larger cities and higher satisfaction with democracy there comes down to the better resources, better situation that those people are in. Now, what can be done, and can anything be changed? Are there agents of trust and progress in society? Can we look at that? We'll move to the next piece of findings. And as we do that, we check with questions. I'll see if more come in. We definitely want to hear from our audience about particular national situations, outliers they were asking, particular factors that played role in their countries to pick on in our further discussion. But at the moment, let's take a look and see how much trust levels differ between people who participate in society, participate in organizations, participate in volunteering, and those who do not. So certainly, it is well known, again in trust research over time, that volunteers, people who are engaged, members of organization, people having interaction with institutions at local, national, or other setting, have higher levels of trust, both in people and institutions. What research has not answered, and there is a space to explore further, is what is a cause and what is an effect. On one hand, it may be said that those who trust are more likely to engage and participate. On the other hand, we could think that organizations, interaction, provides basis for people to get familiar with the situation, to make an impact, and therefore have higher trust. And again, here I would like to ask Shane, I know you did some projects studying people's engagement, people's participation in democracy and different forms of deliberative democracy. What were your findings there?
We had a project, we produced an ebook, sort of a guidebook to how to set up a deliberative democracy forum, and it was based on the experience of the Citizens' Assembly here in Ireland, which I think internationally has been considered quite successful. And one of the reasons it was successful, I believe, is because it had a cross-section of citizens. There weren't any, especially in the last iteration, there weren't any politicians involved. It was just citizens from across different income bands. And they live streamed the expert forums where people would come in and talk to people in a closed setting about giving them information about a particular topic, which then they would study in depth. So I'm going to give Brexit as an example. If there had been a citizens' assembly on Brexit, then you would have had a year-long discussion that would have been public about what Brexit would mean for the UK. And everybody would hopefully become more knowledgeable. It wouldn't be a sudden decision expecting people to be knowledgeable about such a big topic. And I think even if you didn't participate in the Citizens' Assembly or before the Constitutional Convention in Ireland, you knew that it existed, you could learn from it, or you could read about it, but you knew that the government, again, showing that the government is interested, set up something to listen to the public. Now, it may not have picked the most controversial topics, but it picked several topics that needed a public discussion, and it ended up being a very successful format for doing it. And it's been replicated in other countries, like in Australia or Belgium or Poland. And I think even at a local level, it's been successful because, again, it symbolizes a public participation with a very immediate, urgent issue.
So what I find interesting is that new mechanisms were provided that would not necessarily engage each and every citizen, only a small number of people, relatively small number of people, but nevertheless they had positive effect because society at large could know that there are forms provided, that there are forums, that there is an effort to engage, that there are channels to speak. And that is very interesting because even though we showed the finding that volunteers, people who participate, have higher levels of trust, we cannot realistically expect that every person at every stage of life will be able to socialize. There are different circumstances, different stages in life when people have more or less time for social activities, for civic engagement, and that is just a natural state of things. Well, citizen assemblies, other forms of deliberative or direct participation is what we already emphasized. But what are the mechanisms that most people can participate if they are active and volunteering? So we have another set of findings from the EQLS Quality of Life Survey that looks at involvement in unpaid voluntary work by the type of organizations. And what is interesting here is where people participate mostly in case they do some volunteering. So the top category are educational, cultural, sports, and other associations. And second, community or social services. So perspective I'm suggesting is that, well, if people volunteer, they volunteer and interact with others in an area which is basically social services. And it's not that they can replace or that they provide and can compensate to what social protection systems are expected to do. But this could be a mechanism or interface where people interact, where people can feel that they co-decide and co-design and co-deliver and co-produce services, technical terms, but basically they speak about channels for people to engage.
I would just interject there because if you look at the first, which is education, cultural, sports, or professional associations, actually it may not be a social service, but it's what produces the greatest, if I understand correctly, the greatest trust. If I were to go back to Ireland again and take an example, so you saw that statistic on rural distrust in national institutions versus local authorities. The GAA clubs in Ireland it's an Irish sport, and it's embedded in local culture, particularly in rural areas. But rural decline has corresponded with the decline of local GAA clubs, which have had to merge because they don't have enough local players. And it's something that comes up again in one of our projects, like the GAA clubs. It's in decline in rural areas. I think it's doing okay in urban areas. So you see the correspondence in distrust because they're not able to participate in local sports associations. You see it, the inverse of what you're saying there. It's a decline in trust of national institutions because there's this sense of the government is not paying enough attention to rural areas. And because of that, the population is declining and they're losing their associations. So I think it's really important that the government recognizes that as a way of what you're asking here is of promoting trust, is that these associations have to correspond with services.
So that's another important reflection about factors and mechanisms that shape levels of trust. And that resonates with a few comments and questions that we got now from our audience that ask about social capital. What about social capital? Is that the mechanism to nurture and recover trust in society? What about investing in amenities at local level? Yeah, that reminds me one particular emphasis Eurofound came up with when producing reports on volunteering in the past. And it was similar to what you, Shana, were saying. Well, civic engagement, participation, again, is more than an attitude. If you compare countries that have high levels or high proportion of citizens involved in volunteering, social organizations, you discover that these are the countries who invest in infrastructure for that. People may have a wish, but if there isn't a channel, if there isn't an opportunity to convene, if there isn't an opportunity to meet and get basic support of infrastructure, it may not happen.
We found that repeatedly. I know I keep going back to rural Ireland because I think it exemplifies a lot of the trends that you're noticing. There's high levels of inequality in the agricultural sector, not just in Ireland, but in other countries. You also have level poverty, greater poverty in rural areas, less access to transportation, perhaps to broadband, so you don't have access to Wi-Fi. And some of the research we've done here, you have to you can't get it in your house. You have to drive up the road in order to log on to see your email. So the more the government invests in that infrastructure, perhaps the higher, the population growth versus population decline, you'll have more people engaging in associational life. You'll have more people engaging in community services. So
Right.
You'll have greater trust.
So Shana, what I'm hearing in your comment about Ireland is that even in one of the richest societies in Europe, there's poverty. And the ways it exhibits itself is actually through the link or access to essential infrastructure.
Exactly. Yes.
But to take us a little bit out of Ireland, another particular intriguing finding for which we don't have definitive answers, but again, here's an opportunity for our audience, was with regard to volunteering and trust in certain countries. So by and large, as we said, those who volunteer, those who participate, have higher levels of trust in institutions as well as people. But in Spain and Greece, what we found in EQLS in 2016 was exact opposite. Volunteers had lower trust in institutions. And you may wonder why. The hypothesis we suggested that there could have been a situation of involuntary volunteering, where citizens stepped in and began, because they felt they had to, provide services to fill in the services which otherwise would be expected from the state or social protection system or authorities, where the mechanisms that we have via state did not work. So that is something that we could suggest for researchers in our audience to explore further. That would be one of our purposes of today's discussion, to share some findings, but also to give encouragement for our viewers, for our audience, to take these findings, check them against their national context, and maybe initiate further research. What we will do, we will definitely continue focus on public services. There's a lot of reflection going on in Europe. There has been a very important EU-level initiative, a proclamation of European Pillar of Social Rights. Half of it refers to access to quality services, and that's probably important and relevant for most European societies to reflect.
I think actually the European Social Pillar, even if people have never heard about it, I think it goes back to the beginning, your first graph where you showed trust in EU institutions. I'm going to guess, because you don't have the data to show this, but the EU stands for certain values. And I think there is a distrust. For instance, in Spain, we had a report on health inequalities in Spain. And there was a distrust during austerity because of cuts in services. So people did feel like at a local level, they had to substitute, which can create tension and exacerbate distrust. And so those two countries were highly affected by austerity with dramatic rise in unemployment and cuts to services. And it was protests in Spain about the access to health services that changed policy, but it was tension. It was not sort of working together.
So, if you have more data from your national context, do send us the references and pieces. And before we close, there's a very good comment that just came in, and it asks the following. Could we assume that civic or social participation is less frequent in countries where state takes a larger responsibility for social welfare? Well, an easy one to answer. If you look at Nordic countries, for example, where state takes large responsibility, so-called, I would take it in quotation marks, we also have highest levels of civic participation. And again, it comes down to infrastructure. It comes down to mechanisms of engagement and involvement. And state takes responsibility should be taken in quotation marks because state is us, isn't it?
Yes.
These are the mechanisms that citizens have to take care about themselves and society at large.
I think that sums up everything. It's a sense of like the state is us versus the state is them. And we are local services versus the state is not providing those local services. I think the more people think of the state as us, the better off we all are.
Well, as we are approaching the end of the webinar, let's take a moment to look back at what we covered and what takeaways we could have. Shana, do you want to get a go?
I still am fascinated by the gap in trust in EU institutions versus national institutions and parliaments. And I wonder what kind of learning experience national policymakers could have to improve trust, to close the gap between the EU and national and local authorities.
This gap is also very interesting, given there is a certain contrast with the impression you could get from the media because of Brexit coverage. Yeah. There could be a tendency to think that the relationship is different, but it's really only in exceptional cases. Well, we also looked at the role of public services and repeated it a number of times. We showed the negative impact of social insecurity on trust levels. And again, we emphasized it's not about providing absolute security. It's about identifying certain level of basic security that is important. We suggested softly an invitation to see social security as a resource, not necessarily a cost. Some of our findings resonate with trust research that has emphasized over years quality of governance and importance of fair and just institutions. But again, our message today has been that justice has to include social justice as well. And we also ended with certain intriguing findings in relation to volunteering and participation, which is a big topic to expand and on which we would like to hear more from the audience about situation in particular countries. At this point, Shana, I look again at you. Do we invite, or do we get any further questions? I don't see the new ones coming.
I would just comment on civic engagement that I've found actually in the UK that Brexit has corresponded with increasing tension between the voluntary sector and the state, and that is, or national policymakers. So I think the more that governments can support civic engagement at a local level, the better off we are.
Another important thing, again, from your research, I believe, is that there is a high risk in public discourse to simplify the situation and reduce it to debating one particular issue when there is a large complexity of services, engagement mechanisms, and overall democracy in society. Isn't that the
Going
case?
back to the discussion we had about deliberative democracy, one positive, I think one benefit of a deliberative democracy form, whether at a national or local level, is it can illuminate how complex issues are. So you don't end up substituting, in the case of Brexit, the EU for all the other problems a country might have.
And with that, we are just about to open another big topic, which we will not do. I would like to thank Shana for joining us today. I would like to thank audience for joining us today, for the comments you sent and for the questions we will look through afterwards. I thank Eurofound webcasting team, and we are looking forward to meet you again in our next webinars. Goodbye now.
Really good job keeping it going, watching all the signs. Not easy. Not easy at all.
No, I think you did really well.
No, I can't see the questions coming to you, which in the future I need to see, because I can't see what you're seeing. All I know is what you should be seeing, but I don't know if you can see them or not. And
I was surprised we did.